Welcome to the 10th episode of Season 1 STEP program. The first session is the talk What the Plastic Surgeon Needs to Know About the Foot and Ankle to Reconstruct It Well. And the speaker is Dr. Madhu Periyasamy. He has done his DIP&B in plastic surgery in 2010 and his MRCS from Edinburgh 2005. He is a consultant plastic and wound reconstructive surgeon at the Department of Plastic and Reconstructive Microsurgery at Ganga Medical Center and Hospital, Coimbatore. His fields of interest are reconstructive microsurgery, chronic wound and diabetic foot reconstruction, and lower limb reconstruction. And the moderator for this session will be Dr. S. Rajasabapathy, the Chairman, Department of Plastic Surgery and Reconstructive Microsurgery and Burns, and the Director, Ganga Hospital, Coimbatore. Over to you, sir. Thank you.
And in this, we are happy that Madhu is speaking today on this topic. I just only like to tell one thing, because we always say that we need to extend our frontiers. I think that's been the main thing. Extending the frontiers means you can't extend the frontiers without doing a little bit of work. When I was young, there always used to say, there is a Hext company used to put an advertisement which used to say, you can't remold a country without a little mud on your hands. Okay, so you need to work. So similarly, for the last 1 decade, we have been taking on diabetic. Of course, all of us have been treating diabetic foot for all these years. For 30 years we have been doing, but with a special focus we have been doing, so that how we can make a difference in the outcomes. I think it has been thought. And Madhu has been trained with us for the D&B with us. He has been with us and he has taken a very keen interest. And I'm very proud that what he has done and the amount of interest that he has shown. And in this process, it has been a learning lessons for all of us. We find that with a little amount of extra work, with a little bit of extra effort, with a little bit of extra knowledge, I think we can make a big difference. So, over to Madhu for choosing this topic as to what we should know to reconstruct it well, and then we'll take it back. Right, over to you, Madhu. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Sir, I'm just starting to share my screen, sir. Sir, you need to enable my share screen, sir.
Yes, I've done it now.
Yeah, thank you, sir. So, thank you for the introduction, Karthikeyan sir, and SRS sir, I'm indebted to you always. And coming directly to the topic, the foot and ankle, what does a plastic surgeon need to know? Just a minute. So this topic, we're just going to take it through the following headings. First, we'll look at a little bit about the normal foot movements of the foot and ankle. Then we'll go on to a bit about the human gait mechanics. We'll talk a little bit about levers, because as in the hand, even in the foot, levers are the basis of everything that happens there. And then we'll be shifting on to commonly encountered pathomechanics and a little bit about how we can address them so that we get durable reconstructions. So the foot and ankle is a specialized structure which you need to use every day, whether you like it or not, unlike the hand. You cannot keep it aside. Suppose the left foot is injured, to walk, you need to use the left foot. And to that, we need to know about a bit about the normal anatomy and biomechanics of the ankle. The ankle joint is not a single joint. It's a complex of 3 joints: the talocrural, the subtalar, and the transverse tarsal joint. The talocrural is between the tibia and the talus. The subtalar is, just a minute. The subtalar joint is between the talus and the calcaneum. and the transverse tarsal joint, which is a combination of the talonavicular and the calcaneocuboid joints, which is marked in green, is the third joint. The basic movements are dorsiflexion and plantarflexion, which occur about a slightly oblique transverse axis, inversion and eversion, which occur about a anteroposterior axis, and abduction and adduction, which occur about a vertical axis. So this is dorsiflexion and plantarflexion. It occurs about a transverse axis, and this movement is mainly around the talocrural joint. The principal dorsiflexors are the anterior compartment muscles, whereas the plantarflexors are the posterior compartment muscles. The second movement is the inversion and eversion. It's a type of rotatory movement which mostly occurs on the subtalar joint, and the most powerful inverters are the tibialis posterior and anterior combined, and the everters are the peroneus brevis and longus. The abduction and adduction movement occurs about a vertical axis. It's a transverse plane movement which occurs mainly at the transverse tarsal joints. The abductors are mainly the tibialis posterior and the adductors are the peronei. But none of these movements actually occurs in an isolated way. Just a minute. It is always a combination of movements which occur as pronation and supination. A pronation is a combination of abduction, dorsiflexion, and eversion, whereas supination is a combination of plantarflexion, inversion, and adduction. The only point that I want to say here is, as demonstrated so far in all the videos that you have seen, we have been seeing an open chain kinetics. It means that the free hanging foot is moving on the fixed tibia, whereas during gait, everything occurs in reverse. It's a closed chain kinetics that happens. So now we go on to the human gait mechanics. Human gait is a bipedal, biphasic forward propulsion of the human body. It's akin to a controlled fall with the least occurs with the least expenditure of energy, is regulated by the central nervous system, and usually involves rhythmic reciprocal bursts of flexor and extensor activity. Flexor and extensor activity occurs by muscle contraction, but muscle contraction can be either isotonic, which can be either concentric muscle contraction where the muscle shortens as it contracts, or eccentric muscle contraction. As you can see here, the muscle lengthens as it contracts, or the isometric muscle contraction, which is used to maintain position, where the tension increases as the time passes, but there is no change in the length of the muscle. So, phases of gait. So, the basic unit of gait is a gait cycle, which consists of a sequence of events starting from heel strike to heel strike of the same foot again. So the gait cycle can be divided into two main phases. As we said, it is a biphasic mechanism. So it has two main phases: the stance phase, which makes up around 60% of the gait cycle, and the swing phase. The stance phase can be divided into three. It can be divided into a period of double limb support in the starting, a period of single limb support in the middle, and a period of double limb support again at the end of the cycle, stance phase. So the difference between walking and running is that in running there is no double limb support and there is a period of float. So as we said, the events can be divided into stance and swing phases, and the stance phase itself can be divided into three intervals during which all the events occur. These intervals can also be called the first, second, and third rocker. And during each of these intervals, there is an alternating eccentric or concentric contraction of the muscles involved. The muscles involved are mainly the anterior group, the posterior group, the peroneal, and that's it. And to demonstrate the first rocker or the ankle rocker, you can see in this video, this occurs from heel strike to foot flat. Here, the anterior muscles need to be in eccentric contraction. That is, they need to be contracted while lengthening. If they fail to do this, the foot slaps down as it occurs in a foot drop. This causes the patient to get a high stepping gait. The second rocker or the second interval is the tibial rocker. Here, the foot moves from plantar flexion into dorsiflexion. As you can see, this is a closed chain kinematics, and hence everything is happening in reverse actually. Instead of the foot moving on the tibia is rocking forward on the foot. And for this to happen, you need good eccentric contraction of the posterior muscles so that the patient or the person doesn't just fall down so fast. So the muscles need to be contracted while lengthening effectively. And the third or most important, another important rocker is the metatarsal rocker. During this rocker, the foot lifts off on the metatarsal joint. It is most pronounced in the first metatarsal joint, but also involves the metatarsophalangeal joints of all other toes. So here, there is a concentric contraction of the posterior group of muscles, that is the triceps surae. Another important mechanism which we need to know about is the windlass mechanism. So here, this is most important to maintain the integrity of the arch during the third rocker. So during this, whenever the great toe dorsiflexes, you will notice that the first ray flexes. This happens because of the way the intrinsic muscles are inserted into the base of the great toe. And also, most importantly, as you will see here marked in green, the peroneus longus insertion. The peroneus longus is a muscle that is primarily involved with flexion of the first ray. The primary function of the peroneus longus is flexion of the first ray, whereas the primary function of the peroneus brevis is eversion. So as we said, the stance phase, again recap on that. The stance phase lasts around 60% of each gait cycle. The foot hits the ground as a supinated foot, comes into pronation, and then again becomes a supinated rigid lever for push off. So the foot alternates between pronation and supination. The only point that I want to convey here is a pronated foot is a supple shock absorber, whereas a supinated foot is a rigid lever. That happens because of the way the transverse tarsal joints lock. And this locking is initiated by the tibial external rotation and also assisted by the inverters such as the tibialis posterior. So again, stance, normal stance is neutral pronation. And if you go to pathological stance, it can be an overpronation where the foot is the hind foot is entirely overpronated on the tibia, and the entire midfoot, because it is supple, fails eventually and results in a pes planus. The entire medial arch is loaded too much and the patient actually pushes off from the medial side of the foot. Pathological stance can also be a underpronation or a supinated foot that occurs in a club foot or any other cause of a equinus contracture, a congenital equinus contracture. You would see that most of these patients have a lateral border problem. Mostly they have a lateral border ulcer in the midfoot, and this supinated foot is a very rigid foot which cannot absorb shock, and hence there is a lot of arthritis which sets in early. So now coming to the concept of levers, Karthikeyan sir has actually spoken about, and some of the diagrams are same. So during the biomechanics of the hand, he was talking about this. So I just want to recap on this. Levers can be of three classes. A class 1 lever where the fulcrum is in the middle and the load and the effort are on the opposite sides. So now, whenever we want to see the efficiency or mechanical advantage of a lever, assuming that the forces on each side is equal, the efficiency of the lever is directly proportional to the length of the effort arm and inversely proportional to the length of the load arm. That is, the longer the effort arm, more efficient the lever. The longer the load arm, less efficient the lever. So this applies to all classes of levers. Now going to the second class of lever. Sorry. So here the load is in the middle. This can be demonstrated by a wheelbarrow. So the fulcrum is in one end, whereas the effort is in the other end. So here, when this girl jumps, you'll see that she has to, sorry, the video is a bit slow here in this. So if this girl jumps, the entire body weight has to be lifted off on the fulcrum of the metatarsal heads. And that amount of force has to be generated by the triceps surae. So coming to the third class of levers, the third class of levers is one where the force or the effort is in the middle. So class 1 lever, the fulcrum is in the middle. Class 2 lever, the load is in the middle. And class 3 lever, the effort is in the middle. So here, if you see, in these types of levers, the mechanical advantage is always less because the effort arm is always shorter than the load arm. So why am I stressing on this, though this is not related to the foot, is because this is the ultimate reason why you need to keep your below knee stumps short. You cannot have them too long because the longer the below knee stump, the more the effort the patient will have to put in to walk. So the foot in stance acts as a class 1 lever during the early first and early second rocker, and then shifts on to a class 2 lever in the second and third rocker. So the normal mechanics of the foot, you need good joint mobility, coordinated reciprocal muscle function, and structural integrity. Just a minute. So that does the lever function. Sorry there, my daughter was in the picture and she kept making a noise. And now coming on to the commonly encountered pathomechanics. So how does all of this knowledge apply into a everyday practice? So as we said, the common pathomechanics that cause problems include joint contractures, muscle incoordination, and structural failure of the lever. So joint contracture, it can be either the first MTP joint or the ankle joint. Stiffness of the first MCP joint can be an absolutely rigid hallux rigidus where there's even no passive mobility at all, or a functional hallux limitus where the tightness comes on only during gait. This is because of the way, as we said, the intrinsics are there attached to the base of the great toe and the stiffness that occurs with aging. So as we said, the muscles involved in the great toe function and all other toes for that matter, if you can see, they all cross the first MTP joint and then insert into the base of the PPX of the joint, which is responsible for the windlass mechanism. So what are the gait changes that occur when the first MTP joint is tight? During the normal heel off, you'll see the metatarsal rocker, the first MTP joint has to dorsiflex well. Whereas if it is stiff, the patient is forced to actually heel off with a swing. So this causes a heavy amount of shear in the great toe. So for example, this is a young patient. He had an injury of around the first MTP joint, which was exposed. He underwent a graceless flap cover. Everything was all right, healed well, and he started walking. But then, when he comes for review and you ask him to step, he always said, I have a trouble walking, doctor, I have a trouble walking, I have difficulty walking, but he couldn't specify what was the problem. So if you see, if you keep the affected foot on the back with a stiff great toe, that is the amount of step he's able to take. Whereas if you do it with a normal foot, because of the dorsiflexion, he'll be able to have a longer stride length. And this reflects in the way he walks. So this patient, you can see that though he walks, he has a slight limp and there is absolutely no dorsiflexion in the great toe in the right foot. And once we do a Keller gap arthroplasty, his walking actually improves. Though there is a limp, but the speed of the walk and the confidence with which he walks shows there is a lot of difference in the way the foot can be treated. So similarly, this first MTP joint movement can also be obstructed by an FHL contracture. This can be also the result of either neuropathy or trauma, where a VIC-like condition causes flexion contracture of all the toes and causes the patient to have a stepping gait and hence a shorter stride length, and hence they have to take more number of steps to cover the same distance. So this causes an increased amount of energy expenditure and lesser amount of walking and ultimately damage to the foot. So the next joint we are concerned is with the ankle joint, where we have an equinus gait. We always think that an equinus gait is a problematic gait, but sometimes it can actually be a beneficial equinus gait, as you'll be seeing now. So what happens during equinus gait? So as we said, this picture, this video again, you need a concentric or eccentric contraction and a good relaxation of the posterior muscles for flat full foot loading. If it is tight, there will be an early heel off and hence the forefoot will have a higher amount of stress. So this may lead to metatarsalgia, or in patients who do not have sensation, it can lead to metatarsal ulcers, which needs to be addressed either by Achilles tendon lengthenings or by gastrocsoleus recessions. But let's come to this interesting case here. This was a gentleman who came with a heel pad avulsion. The entire structure, the musculoskeletal system was intact. There was no calcaneal fracture, there was no Achilles tendon avulsion, there was no rupture of the Achilles tendon, and there was no plantar fascia injury also. So we put him on a graceless flap, settled well, contour was very nice, no ulcers absolutely. We thought very good, flap is cushioning everything well. But then we were wondering actually what is happening. So we started this fellow to walk and we took a close video, and you can actually see that he's not placing the heel on the ground. He's walking with an equinus gait, an intentional equinus gait. So this prevents the insensate part from hitting the ground. This was actually published by Somalad in a very early paper where they said that in any patient who has a reconstructed foot, the patient preferably avoids walking on the reconstructed area. But then the issue is our reconstructions have to allow them to do it. So if you see the pedobarogram of this person, you'll see that absolutely there is no heel strike. So he's actually walking with this entire load on the forefoot. Whereas the opposite side, you can see there is a heel strike. So why this question here? Why this equinus? What is a beneficial equinus? So here you see there are three flaps covering the similar defects. A free graceless flap, which is thin and settled very well. A free latissimus dorsi flap, slightly more bulkier. And a free ALT flap, which is very bulky. So as I said, patients actually compensate when they want to when they have a foot injury. But our flaps have to allow them to do that compensation. Here, the bulky ALT flap did not allow the patient to do an intentional equinus enough so as to avoid hitting the inside side flap and resulting in ulcers. Hence, the idea here you need to take out of this is to, whenever you flap a heel, try to make it as less bulky as possible. Or if you are necessitated to put a bulky flap, please do a thinning so as to allow the patient to walk with an equinus. So the next condition is problems due to muscle incoordination. We have seen dynamic equinus. We have already seen equinus. So we'll be concentrating on the peroneus. It will be a peroneal overdrive or a peroneal insufficiency. So a peroneal overdrive is because, as I said, the peroneus longus, the main function is flexion of the first ray. You'll see the insertion of the peroneus longus. It wraps around the base of the fifth metatarsal and then crosses across the deepest layer of the sole and inserts into the base of the first metatarsal. So its primary function is flexion of the first ray during initial heel off. So this helps to maintain the arch. So to diagnose a peroneal overdrive, you put a thumb on the first metatarsal and the other thumbs here and ask the patient to plantar flex, and you will feel a differential amount of force. So this peroneal overdrive is actually the reason why patients, even when they do not have a great toe to cause a clawing, get an ulcer over the first metatarsal head. So this is an overactive peroneal. Whereas if you have an underactive or insufficient peronei, what happens is an inverted foot. As I said earlier, an inverted, supinated, rigid foot where the patient starts having ulcers over the lateral border of the midfoot. So this needs to be corrected either by soft tissue procedures if you have a soft and pliable foot, or if the bony deformity is so much that you cannot do it, you need to do a bony procedure to fuse it. So now coming to the third problem, a structural failure of the levers. So this can happen mainly in two places, either the midfoot or the Achilles tendon. So as we said, the midfoot lever is very important for heel off or this taking off this entire load by this force. So you need the structural lever to lift this load by using this force. If the midfoot breaks, what happens is you get a fulcrum shift. The fulcrum is no longer in the metatarsal head because this has broken. The fulcrum shifts here. So in fact, you have a less efficient lever and you have a midfoot bony prominence which is never going to correct because of the force of the Achilles tendon. So if you encounter this in trauma, you need to correct it. So how do you diagnose it? You diagnose it by a weight-bearing lateral X-ray by drawing a straight line through the first metatarsal, which must coincide with the line through the long axis of the talus. If there is an angle, it is a midfoot collapse. So if you ever encounter this situation in a trauma, it is always better to fuse the foot before you flap it, or at least flap it and send the patient in for a fusion before you start to mobilize them. Otherwise, you're going to end up with ulcers in the midfoot or painful midfoot if the patient is sensate. So as you can see here, the fulcrum is here in the normal foot, whereas the fulcrum has shifted to the midfoot in the affected foot. So lever failure, midfoot we have seen, it can also occur because of force failure. As we see in this wheelbarrow, if the force fails, the wheelbarrow collapses immediately. This is a class 2 lever where the load is in the middle. So if the force fails, the entire thing collapses backwards and you get what is known as a calcaneal gait, resulting in heel ulcers or heel pain. So whether you have pain or an ulcer ultimately only depends on whether the patient has sensation or doesn't have sensation. Ultimately, the pathology is the same. If there is a pathomechanics, the patient is sensate, you'll have a painful foot. If it is insensate, you'll have an ulcerated foot. So the force failure can occur either because of an Achilles tendon rupture or a type 3B Charcot fracture or the loss of the entire calcaneum itself. So for example, this results, as we said, in a shift of the entire load to the heel. And can this be reconstructed? Yes, it can be reconstructed. It can be reconstructed by soft tissue procedures, providing you have a good calcaneum. For example, this patient, you see, has undergone an FHL transfer, and actually he can do a single leg raise on the affected leg. The ultimate test for integrity of any Achilles tendon reconstruction is single leg raise on the affected leg. Here you can see the width of the gastrocnemius and soleus, whereas here it's totally atrophied, telling you that it's actually not being used, and it is the FHL that is allowing the single leg raise. Another example which we want to show you is a patient who comes in with the entire calcaneum destroyed. He also has a posterior tibial nerve injury, and he comes in with this callus over here, but he came for this wound which was not healing. So we took him off, we stretched it out, we put a gracilis in, had a stable wound healing, and then allowed him to walk. This was during our early period when we had still not learned what was happening. So ultimately this fellow came back with an ulcer over here, saying, sir, this is not healing at all, whatever you do. Then we went, read up the whole thing, and ultimately we put him on a pedobarogram, and then found out that he had a calcaneal gait because the Achilles tendon was not able to do its function to put load on the forefoot. So the force was not there, hence the forefoot was not being loaded. Hence we went in for a dorsal plate for this patient. So the only answer in such cases is an ankle fusion. So, and with this, I end my talk. Thank you, sir. Thank you for the opportunity. I hope I've just touched, I've not completely gone into all the pathomechanics. I've just touched few within whatever I could say within this time allotted to me. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Thank you, Madhu. The comments that I could give are, I think it's a very enlightening one for the people who have been in the webinar. A lot of time back now, William Osler said, as is your anatomy, so is your practice. So similarly, I think when you talk something, when you take up a specialty, what we really need to know, we really need to go into the fundamentals, basics, and then we find that we are always able to do something a lot better. The outcomes are a lot better. So over this short period of time, we have seen so many webinars. In all the webinars which have been very impressive, you will find the difference has been, they would have been used the fundamental principle of anatomy or pathology. I think that's what it would have been. So over to people for their comments. And I find there is there's only one thing. So what is your advice when I go in to do a flap for the entire sole of foot?
Sir, the entire sole, you don't have much of an option. So you need to flap the entire sole and you need to see what is the structure, and you need to try to mimic, or you need to try to restore the original biomechanics. That's it you can do, sir. You can try to put in a sensate flap if the patient has a sensate donor. If the patient does not have a sensate donor, there is no point doing it. For example, diabetic foot, I can see a lot of young people trying to put a sensory flap in a diabetic foot. You have a burnt out neuropathy. There is no sensory donor. So there's no point trying to do a sensate flap in a diabetic foot. It doesn't work. Except maybe in some early patients who still have the saphenous nerve, which is still sensate, because it arises from above the knee.
Yeah, Kathy, one nice point. What do you do when you have to flap the whole sole? I think normally all of us will do a free flap, because the entire sole, nothing else happens. And usually a muzzle flap is our choice. But then from the very early times I found, which are those fellows who continue to walk, which are those fellows who make an ulcer. If the skeletal integrity of the foot has been fine, okay, all those fellows did well. But whereas whenever there's a skeletal integrity is gone, The integrity of the skeleton can be gone in two ways. One, by fracture. Other is by joint dislocation. So even if it's a fracture, these fellows they can escape better. But then, if there's a joint dislocation that has happened, okay, like this fracture, something has happened at the time of injury, when you are flat, and in all those people, they have formed ulcers. I think they had problems. That's one. And second, you have a foot which has got a talus calcaneum and then the first ray, or you have the lateral half there, and you find even if one half of it is fine, okay, so you find that the great ray and the second ray problem is problem, and then that will also be alright because he will be preferentially be walking on the outer border of his foot, or if the inner border is all right, he'll be walking on the inner border of the foot. But then if there is a total breakdown or somewhere that the transverse arch gone or all the places are injured, invariably they will have an ulcer unless you are extraordinarily careful with shoes. Okay, that's the idea. So it's not the flap that's the problem, it's the what is below the flap that's the problem. So I'm sure you will also be able to read it. Yeah, you can tell this, no? Recommended reading, you can tell the books, Madhu.
Yes, sir. So, from Vamshidharan, we have how does loading weight bearing compensate when one unit of the foot is dysfunctional? See, for example, that's what the entire talk is about. If we have an 80 kilo person, for every step he takes, during the phase of single leg stance, the entire 80 kilo has to go through that foot. And the pressure, which is force per unit area, depends on the surface area of the functional foot. I hope I'm clear. So when there is a functional foot and the surface area is maximized, that is when you get the least amount of pressure. And if one area is dysfunctional, the entire load or that 80 kilo will shift to the dysfunctional smaller area. And that will definitely cause a problem. So how important is to correct it? It is very important. That is the only idea behind this entire talk itself.
There's a recommended reading.
Yes, sir. Sir, recommended reading is, I think we can start with gait analysis in, for example, in this foot and ankle surgery books, sir. We have Whittle's gait analysis, and there is another book, I think I'll share it with Vamshidharan. I don't get the name now. I'll share it with Vamshidharan, sir. And any recommended reading, yeah, for understanding biomechanics of the foot and implications, rather than a single book, I think you need to read a lot of papers. That is where we get knowledge about. For example, functional hallux limitus is well explained in the clinics, in a paper in the clinics. Like that, you need to, it's from multiple sources. So that's the way you get understanding about it. Any one single book is difficult. This foot and ankle biomechanics book, I'll just get it now. I'll just give it, I'll give the name before this talk ends. So for Charcot's foot, what can be done to restore biomechanics to normal? So for Charcot's foot, correct what is broken. That's it. If you have a type 3B Charcot foot of the calcaneum, do a calcaneal fusion with the screws. If you have a midfoot collapse, correct the midfoot. And in the only thing I want to do is, for example, in plastic surgeons, we might actually get to see early Charcot foot. Early Charcot foot, which we might actually mistake as a cellulitic foot. So this can be diagnosed by a weight-bearing lateral X-ray. So if you see an amount of bony disruption in the midfoot with swelling, redness, there won't be any pain, and the patient will still keep walking. The only thing is the patient won't have any constitutional symptoms and his CRP will be normal. If you ever get to see such a patient, immediately protect the foot. That is the only way you can do. You can actually prevent it from further bone loss. Because in Charcot, everything depends on the amount of residual bone. Whether you fuse or you cannot fuse depends on the amount of residual bone. Hence, it's important to protect the foot from day one to maximize bone, to minimize bone loss. And in a foot with ulcer, should we address the basic biomechanical defect first, followed by reconstruction for durable result? Yes, if you have a big ulcer, which can be a reason where if you are putting implants, it's always better to have an ulcer-free foot. Whereas if you're not putting in implants, we would prefer to go in if there is no sign of colon or invasive infection. There'll always be colonization in any ulcerated foot, but if there is no sign of invasive infection, you can address the biomechanics directly. Whereas if you are putting an implant, it is always better to have a wound-free foot before you operate. So, do you recommend that patients who have undergone corrective surgery will not require external offloading? Yeah, that's a good question. So, let's clarify here about external offloading. External offloading means footwear and orthosis. Footwear is not recommended for ulcer healing. The only recommendation for ulcer healing is knee loading, knee weight bearing or patellar weight bearing orthosis. So it can be a Charcot boot or it can be a foot orthosis. So a non-removable orthosis is the gold standard, otherwise called the total contact cast. Or in other words to say, footwear has no role in ulcer healing. So if you have undergone corrective surgery and you have a foot that is free from ulcer, otherwise called a foot in remission, you must always put them on footwear to prevent another ulcer. It can be either a transfer ulcer or it can be a recurrence. So this can happen, but however, to minimize the chances, we always prefer to, we advise the patient to wear an external offloading device, which is usually a custom made footwear. So from Rajan sir, most of our patients don't seem to be convinced with such need for surgeries. Sir, if patients are never convinced, sir, it's about how much we are convinced. That's my only answer to this, sir.
Yeah.
It's only about how much you are convinced.
Yeah, I just, Rajan, I always keep telling people, unless you are convinced, you can't convince another person. These are the people who are most easily to be convinced. We feel they are so happy if we tell them that this is what we do. And I explain to them, they said, sir, fantastic, sir, so nice. The next question they ask is, when would you like to get operated? Like, when will you operate on this? So these are the people who are easily convinced. So we have to be convinced first, one. And secondly, we need to diagnose what is the problem. So I think a lot of fundamentals has to be, we have to be thorough in choosing this. So do you have time, Madhu, or no? I think Karthikeyan has to intervene anything.
Yes, sir. Another 5 minutes, sir.
Yeah, another 5 minutes. Okay. Yeah, Madhu, then keep going quickly. Tension procedures,
Dr. Dellon advises nerve decompression in neuropathic foot in early cases.
That's a good point.
So that's a good point, madam. And the very specific word is early cases. Diabetic neuropathy can be an early neuropathy or a burnt out late neuropathy. We always prefer to do nerve decompression only in early cases. And by nerve decompression, you only take away the compressive component of the double hit problem that the nerve undergoes, where the first hit is actually the generalized neuropathy. So the subclinical compression at the sites of anatomical nerve compression can be addressed in these patients, but the problem is most of these patients never present to the plastic surgeon. We need to talk more to the physician community for them to start referring these cases to us. And another point to be noted is, it is most important to identify these cases by doing a tapping over the site of compression and looking for a Tinel sign. If the Tinel sign is there, we go ahead and decompress. If there is no Tinel sign, we do not decompress. That is the protocol right now. And another thing is, doing a decompression does not prevent neuropathy from progressing. It only slows down progression of neuropathy. Thank you, madam. And Gunashekaran, tendon sling procedures versus implants. Which do you recommend? Midfoot collapse, implants, Guna? There is no other question. It is always implants and fusion. Because even in any Charcot midfoot collapse, it is very unlikely that the bone will fuse. It is mostly a load-bearing implant. So you need to have very good quality load-bearing implants. Please please ask your orthopedic colleague not to compromise on the quality of implants, or you get an implant failure and then it is very difficult to remove that implant and again do a reprocedure. So gait retraining like hand physiotherapy for foot rehabilitation. Yes, there is. We have just started a gait lab, and I think I'll be able to talk more about that in future, because my experience with that is also limited, but balance training, gait retraining is very important. So how often do you encounter recurrence of ulcers with compliant patients using footwear? Yes, we do encounter recurrence of ulcers. Maybe it may be around 20%, 25%. There will be an ulcer, but it may not be the original ulcer. It can be a transfer ulcer or a new ulcer or a new pathology. This patient always has a biomechanically deficient leg without sensation. Hence, they will prefer to keep on walking till they start getting calluses and ulcers. So you need to keep these patients continuously on surveillance.
Sir, thank you. I think we are running out of time.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Sir, would you like to sort of...
Yes, sum up. What I would like to say is that along with the STEP program, it's humble this thing to all our plastic surgeons. We need to expand our frontiers. So this, I think, is one of the big things which can be helpful to us for the future. And we have been having a good experience with this. But the point is, we need to give, as I always say, whenever we take a specialty, we need to give a perceivable difference in outcome between us and the other person. So that's the word. You know? There is a perceivable difference. Okay, that perceivable difference in outcome can be given only when the outcome is big. Okay, so to make that big jump, what we need to do is we need to know this basics, fundamentals, and also we need to remember it's a collaborative effort. Most of the patients whom you operate, this is not an easy operation. This is not an easy practice. Operation is easy, but practicing diabetic foot is not easy, because you are loaded up with a lot of dungeon things also, bad smelling, foul smelling. It's not a clean cut, nice field. That is one. And secondly, most of them are compromised patients. They are all with comorbidities. So if you are setting up a big diabetic foot practice, what we have in our place now is suddenly you will find this. They all come with ejection fraction of 25. Then they got a renal problem, faint. There's all this there. So that means it's not a question of we becoming good. What you need to do, you need to have an anesthetic setup which does only nerve blocks. We never give spinal for them. The nerve blocks, that means anesthesia has to improve. You need to have a good cardiology backup, vision backup. All those things have to improve. So that's what I say. No, you cannot improve only by yourself. This is another one field where collaborative effort is very essential. So I think that will be the summing up point, Karthik.
Thank you, sir.
And as I said, just a word, sir. As I said, the book is Man's Surgery of Foot and Ankle, sir. I just had a thought block. I just got it. So it is.
I thought you'll show the picture, no?
Surgery of the Foot and Ankle by Man, sir. MANN. Yes, yeah. I've sent it as a message to everybody, sir.
Yeah. Thank you, Madhu. Thank you so much. I think today the STEP program, actually, you're talking about the steps, and yes, it's most important because it has been an eye opener. I've been happy on two counts. One is I've chosen Madhu to give this talk and this particular topic. Second was, it was really an eye-opener when you said when you do a flap on the dorsum of the foot, the patient is not able to walk properly. Now that makes us completely think in a different way. Thank you, Dr. Madhu, and thank you, SRS sir, for your wonderful summing up of the entire session.